Special thanks to WaterStone for sponsoring Socrates in the Studio Season 3. There's something different about consciousness. The greatest computer in the world, I can say, just as I can say flatly, 1 + 1 will always equal 2. The greatest computer in the world cannot make the leap. It's an infinite leap to this thing we call consciousness. It's another thing.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Computers compute. Persons think. Those are two qualitatively different activities. They're not quantitatively different. There's not a difference of degree there. It's not as if we had a supercomputer, if we had but well enough in time, we could design a computer that could one day think. That's why intelligence can only be and will only ever be artificial. I think part of the problem here is that, again, philosophy gets overawed by scientific progress. And that's been particularly true of the last 20, 30 years, but it's, I think, also true of the last 200 years. I was reading a history of the mind-body problem a few years ago, big 2-volume history. I got to a bit in the middle of the 19th century where they discovered the telegram technology. And it's amazing to think what it would have been like. We tend to think of the internet, the digital revolution, as just this sort of unprecedented technological revolution, shrinking the world in extraordinary, networking the world in extraordinary ways. But just imagine going from, 1 year, it taking 3 weeks to get a letter from London to Delhi to 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Actually, that's the kind of thing we forget about.
Yeah.
I mean, the technology
Just
of the telegraph in the mid-19th century, it must have been...
And here's the point. Philosophers of mind at the time were saying, well, we don't really understand consciousness. We don't understand what the mind is. But what we do know is that whatever's going on in the mind and whatever's going on in consciousness, it must involve something like the technology of the telegram. Right? Now, fast forward to the 1970s. Huge advances in computational technology, huge advances, post-Turing, breakthrough in computers, right? So again, we see the computer just like they saw the telegram in the 19th century. Think, well, we don't really understand the mind. We don't understand consciousness. But what we do know is that whatever is really going on in that mind thing, it must be something like a computer. So this is the metaphor. This is the model we've got to work with, and it's just it's failed. I mean, it's that whole computational theory of mind has been, I would say, widely discredited. Over the last 30 years, John Searle was, and not simply by theists or people who were kind of had with vested interest, but by philosophers who claim to be naturalists. And
I wish I didn't know we would be talking about this. I should have planned it better.
But there was something. Deep waters
but there was something about in the conversation you were having with the aforementioned figures, somebody brought up the Penrose theorem. I don't remember it now.
Oh yes. Were we discussing the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorem, or were we talking about Penrose's critique of computational theories of mind?
The latter.
Yes, the latter. Yes, so Roger Penrose and John Lucas, the great Oxford philosopher, and the great John Lucas and Roger Penrose is the great sort of Oxford physicist, developed an argument based on Gödel's incompleteness theorems for why minds why the computational theory of mind couldn't possibly work. It's a very technical argument, but it's broadly, I don't think it's been overturned. I mean, it didn't really sort of do the rounds much in analytic philosophy of mind. But I remember reading and getting into it about 20 years ago and thinking that there's really something there that really, when you dig deep into what a computer is, really sort of just ones and zeros, it just bears no resemblance at all to what we think of when we're reflecting on mind. And I think it just one can engage in all sorts of complex philosophical arguments, but at the root of it all is just this the commitment to mind. Does seem to be basic. It does seem to be upstream. Consciousness isn't like an add-on. Consciousness is the condition of the possibility of any engagement with the world at all, any reflection upon the world, any experience. It's upstream of everything else, including the claim that all truths are scientific truths, all that the mind is the brain. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is that there are truths that the omniscient neuroscientist does not know. Suppose we complete neuroscience. That is, suppose we get to the point, not inconceivable, where there are no facts about the human brain that elude us. Question, do we therefore know, can we read minds? Can the omniscient neuroscientist read minds? I think it's self-evident. No, of course not. Why? Because to have a mind, to be a subject and not an object, to be a person, is to have private, privileged access to the content of our own thoughts. And nobody else has access to it. That's just what it means to have a mind. So it's, now that's a minority view in the philosophy profession. That's certainly true. I'm used to holding minority views. It's a lot of fun. But certainly if you're a theist, you can be a materialist and a theist. You can have a materialist theory of mind in principle. Somebody like Peter van Inwagen would be a case of that, a great philosopher at Notre Dame. But generally speaking, if you think the ultimate constituent of reality is mind rather than matter, then our little minds are not going to pose too much of a philosophical problem.
Gosh, there's a lot here. I think about C.S. Lewis. I never remember the exact quote, but he was talking about if our brains evolved out of the primordial soup via accidents and random mutations, why would we trust our brains?
Yes.
That doesn't
Yeah,
make
this
sense.
is an argument he puts forward in chapter 5 of his book on miracles from 1955, I think, mid-50s. And it's an argument that he revised in light of criticisms advanced by the great Elizabeth Anscombe at a meeting of the Oxford Socratic Club in 1948. And she was right in her criticisms, but he was right in the argument as it was refined. And then it was picked up again by the great Alvin Plantinga in the early 1970s. It's sometimes called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And the idea of Lewis's insight, which he gets, I think, from Chesterton. Chesterton gets it from Arthur Balfour, who was a British prime minister and also no mean philosopher of religion. He wrote a book called Theism and Naturalism based on his Gifford lectures.
Imagine the prime
you
ministers
imagine that?
we used to
Can you
have in
imagine
this country.
that?
Just
quality.
imagine.
Scarcely
Yeah.
more than 100 years ago, you had a prime minister who would, who would write philosophy of religion, engage in develop very, very interesting arguments, and he developed something like that argument. And the thought is that evolution is not interested in the development of cognitive faculties that seek truth. All that natural selection is interested in is survival fitness, is adaptive value. Now, sometimes it will be the case that tracking truth will confer adaptive value, right? If you can know that there are 2 tigers in the next door valley and 2 tigers in the other valley, it's good. You're more likely to survive. But there are you can imagine all sorts of other scenarios in the history of hominids where falsehood tracking will confer adaptive value. After all, what is it the atheists tell us about where religion must have come from? It is a belief that a set of beliefs that are systematically false, but must have conferred some sort of adaptive value, maybe a consoling power, or it's a very convenient social technology, or a coordinating mechanism, or something. Some just so story about how we got religion. And that seems to be all you're really allowed to help yourself to on a kind of strictly atheistic account, evolutionary account of human origins and development. And so Lewis's point, and buttressed by Plantinga with a bit more sort of analytic philosophical firepower, is simply that naturalism refutes itself. Like a strictly naturalistic account of evolution effectively ends up sawing off the branch that it's sitting on, because it can give no account of the reliability of our cognitive faculties, because it can only give an account of our development in terms of survival tracking.
I want to talk a little bit about materialism, but before that, when we think of the West, can't help thinking of the Enlightenment. That's just me. But the idea of reason, the reasonableness of reason, the efficacy of reason, and then, of course, the limits of reason. You spoke a little bit in one of the videos I watched of you. It may have been the same one about Kant. Can you talk a little bit for someone like me who knows nothing of Immanuel Kant and his critique of pure reason?
So I mean, Kant is the person we get the name, get the label Enlightenment from. He writes this famous essay in 1784, Was ist Aufklärung? What is Enlightenment? And that age becomes known as the age of the Aufklärer, the German Enlightenments, or the Lumière in French, the sort of the light.
So the German word for enlightenment is Aufklärung?
Aufklärung, yes. And the
it's
Enlightenment,
like clearing it up.
Yes, kind of.
Clearing.
Yes,
it's so funny how German words
don't. Yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought about that.
It's not as... Enlightenment sounds so much better
Absolutely.
than the up-clearing, or the clearing up.
Exactly right. And he publishes in the summer of 1781 a book, Kritik der reinen Vernunft, the Critique of Pure Reason. And I was just actually lecturing to my students about this the other day. There's an ambiguity, I think, in that title. It can mean both the critique that reason undertakes, but also the critique that the critique of reason with reason as its target.
Okay, so was that an intentional double entendre? Because when you hear the title, it sounds like Luther calling reason
it sounds
the devil's whore.
Yes, exactly.
But so you're saying he was talking about both sides of it?
I think so. Yes. So his basic point is that reason often has a tendency to overreach itself, particularly to range beyond what is given to us in sense experience. So Kant is wrestling the two great streams of the philosophical tradition, one that tends to stress the validity of sense experience above all else, and the other that tends to stress the validity of reason and the above all else. And the question is, how do we reconcile these two traditions? And Kant's genius was to see that reason and experience must somehow be woven together. Reason mustn't overreach itself, mustn't go beyond what's given to us in sense experience. Nevertheless, sense experience on its own can't just be the whole story. It can't just be that we sort of, when we're experiencing the world, there's some sort of avalanche of raw, unpixelated data that just sort of, tumbles into our brains. There must be some filtering mechanism. There must be something that's doing the pixelating. Why? Because we are undergoing intelligible experience. Nobody doubts that. Even if you're a brain in a vat, or even if you're being persistently deluded, you're undergoing some kind of intelligible experience. And the world, he says, doesn't give itself ready-wrapped. It doesn't there's nothing in the world. There's nothing in atoms and laws of nature that pixelates itself. So he comes up with this very, very elaborate and sort of an interesting fusion in the critical philosophy over the course of the 1780s. But what you see here, again, as with Descartes, we talked about it a little bit earlier, is again, whether he's right or wrong, again, you see this turn to the subject, the turn towards thinking about reality and thinking about the deepest problems that reality gives us, fundamentally in terms of the subject and of the self. It's my mind, it's my reason. And very often, certainly in the What is Enlightenment essay, the notion, the way enlightenment is understood is primarily through autonomous reason. The idea that reason is something that couldn't possibly be distributed, that reason isn't something that could be given to us by the church or through scripture or through tradition, but really is something that we're kind of born with and that we have to sort of exercise ourselves. And that's the sort of kernel of the kind of Enlightenment thinking as we think back on it today. And it seems to me, I mean, look, it's so strange the way we periodize, the way we carve up history. I mean, it's so self-congratulatory, that term, Enlightenment. I mean, what comes before
it's
Enlightenment?
Ridiculous. I mean, it's just
darkness,
like the Dark Ages.
And death. It's amazing how kind of freighted and loaded these periodizations are. I mean, Renaissance, what comes before the Renaissance, it's death, the darkness, it's death. The Middle Ages, between what? The glories of Greece and Rome, and then the rebirth of the glories of Greece and Rome. And as Tom Holland and others have shown, Greece and Rome, the moral universe of Greece and Rome was not necessarily enlightened, and it wasn't something that would sort of excite us to think about new birth and life. So yes, I mean the Enlightenment, it always sits slightly uncomfortably alongside those two well springs of the West that you I think, absolutely correctly and plausibly described before of the Hellenic and the Hebraic. In many ways, it was an attempt to repudiate certainly the Hebraic, but also the Hellenic. If you think of the Hellenic as people like Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, I mean, what Descartes is repudiating, what Kant is trying to repudiate, what Hume and Berkeley and Locke are throwing away, is that Hellenic inheritance, right? Plato and Aristotle
what
believe
way?
because Plato believes in a lot of spooky stuff. He may not believe in, he may not have been an Abrahamic monotheist, but he believed that there is this timeless, spaceless world of forms. I mean, there is a Platonic heaven. He certainly didn't believe that science was the be-all and end-all. Quite the reverse. He thought that the world that science explores is contingent. It's constantly changing. It's constantly vulnerable to destruction. And so Plato is insistent that we can't have any certain knowledge of a world that is constantly changing. And there's something true about that. I mean, if I found that my children were being taught physics from a textbook from the 1920s, I'd be concerned because science is changing the whole time.
Yeah.
It's an unstable kind of knowledge in that sense. If I discovered that my children were being taught maths from a textbook from the 1920s, I'd be over the moon, right? I wouldn't be worried that they'd be being teaching that they would be being taught mathematical errors. And so for Plato, and indeed for the theistic tradition, the idea that where the mind can latch onto truths that are transcendent, you're attaining knowledge that's actually more secure precisely because they're the necessary truths that you're tracking, the true no matter what. And that's a very sort of plausible way of thinking. But it gets entirely, both the Hellenic and the Hebraic, many of the sort of insights of those two traditions, the Hellenic and the Hebraic, get brushed aside effectively as an age of darkness that preceded the moment of enlightenment in broadly the late 18th century.